And a chap whose name you've probably come across, his sobriquet, shall we say, Mr. Loophole, becomes quite well known when he's defended somebody, often quite a famous footballer or a football manager, somebody in the public eye. They get done for speeding often, or maybe drink driving, and then Mr. Loophole steps in, and the person is suddenly led off the charge. They're not found guilty. Hence his name, Mr. Loophole. He finds the loopholes in the law that gets people off the charges. His real name is Nick Freeman, and he runs his own legal practice, Freeman and Co., in Manchester these days. But Nick is originally from Nottingham and comes back to these parts when he has the time to catch up with friends and family back in Nottinghamshire. And last time he was this way, we invited him in to have a little bit of a natter, and he told me about his early years in Nottingham.
Born in Nottingham, my grandfather came over from Romania in 1898, and he went on to live to 103 and a quarter, so he lived in 3 centuries. So he was very, very poor. They were as poor as can be, and he left school at 12, started pushing barrows in the market, set up a business, had an office in the lace market, had a very small factory in Hucknall, and basically, and then we had 2 shops on King Street, Jeanette's of King Street, which was my grandma's name, selling ladies' gear. And my dad... my grandfather lost one of his sons on D-Day. His eldest son died on D-Day when he was 21. And my dad, who was 7 years younger than Frank, I'm called after Frank, he was told, you're going into the business, because my grandpa used to go to South Africa for 5 months every year from the age of 50 to 85. That's why I lived to 103. So there was a small business which provided my dad with plenty of time to spend on the golf course, which he did almost every day. He had a very good secretary, so it provided him with a nice lifestyle. He wasn't ambitious. He was a magistrate here for 25 years, and he told me and my brothers, there's no business for you boys to go into, so you need to make your own way. And when I was about 7, I remember my dad saying to me, he was picking me up from Sunday school, and he said, what are you going to do when you leave school? And it caught me totally out, I wasn't prepared for it. And I said, well, what earns the most, Dad? And he said, well, solicitors, they earn about £4,000 a year, not an hour, a year. It's back in 1963. And I said, okay, I'll be a solicitor. And then I said, what do solicitors do? And he said, they argue for a living. I thought, wow, argue for a living, no clip round the ear, and you get paid a fairly good amount of money. And I loved arguing even then. That'll do nicely for me. And really, apart from wanting to be a professional golfer, and I wasn't really good enough, and didn't, I hate travelling in any case, that's always what I wanted to do. So I went away to boarding school. I went to Uppingham. I was in the same class as Stephen Fry. That's always been my claim to fame for 2 years. And then I had a gap year because I took my A-levels a year early. And then I came back and I actually did 3 years at Trent Poly. And I rented a small flat in Beeston, and that was a happy time. I used to go to the Cavern and all the places, Isabella's nightclub. It was a good time, not very exacting, 12 hours work a week. And I remember thinking we could do this in a year. Why are we wasting 3 years doing it? And during the holidays, I would work as an assistant court clerk in the Guildhall in Nottingham Magistrates Court. And the boss then was George Yandel, and of course and my job was to sit in court in the morning as an assistant court clerk. So basically I was just watching, doing a bit of filling in paper. But I remember thinking, these guys, I mean, it sounds terribly arrogant, but they're not that great. You watch how people speak. Are they looking? Are they smart? Are their shoes clean? Is the suit pressed? Are they captivating their audience? Are they holding their attention? Are they eloquent? And I thought, wow. I'm sure I could do this. And then in the afternoons, I would organise the magistrates' rota. I think Mrs. Clay and Mrs. North, they were the 2 ladies who helped me. So I organised all the holidays, and it was a fantastic experience. And I do remember one very funny story. I was 21, so I was obviously just finishing my degree and working in the court before I finished my degree. And I was living then with a lady, an Israeli fire eater who was 28. And my parents weren't at all happy about it. We lived in Rise Park in Arnold. And I remember sitting in court, and I was looking down at some papers, and then I heard this name, Sarah Ciso. And I looked up and I thought, oh my God, it's her. And she appeared in the same court that I was sitting. She'd been accused of shoplifting. Fairy Liquid had gone up quite a lot, and she was unhappy about the price, so she'd swapped the ticket with another label. Any case, it was just quite a weird story.
Was that the end of the relationship?
It ended soon afterwards, much to the relief of my parents. They weren't happy about it.
Because she was a thief or a fire eater?
No,
Like
they just thought
was the greater problem.
I was 21 and I had a future ahead of me, and I didn't really want to be settling down with a 28-year-old lady at that time. She was a lovely lady, but she actually followed me up to Manchester, but that's another story.
Nick Freeman, Mr. Loophole. So how did he become known for his ability to get people off charges? When did he realise there was a job for him? So back to Nick Freeman, Mr. Loophole. You heard about his life in Nottingham growing up and then getting into the world of law, studying at Trent Polytechnic as it was then and working in the local courts. But what was the journey that led him to become somebody who was absolutely focused on getting people off cases and realising that this was something you could do by adhering to the absolute letter of the law?
I was called Mr. Loophole by the press. There were a couple of reporters who were following me constantly in court. Wherever I turned up in court, they seemed to know where I was. And they were following me, and they started referring to Mr. Loophole. And, of course, I'd never even thought of the name, never heard of it, and I didn't like it. I mean, loophole suggests something sinister, underhand, devious, and I'm none of those things. But it stuck, and, every time I did a case, there would be, if it was a case with some interest, either from a publicity perspective, profile perspective, or maybe from a legal perspective, this grave injustice that I was causing the society, it will be Mr. Loophole does this or Mr. Loophole does that. And I thought, well, I'm not going to get rid of it. But I just thought, well, I'll leave it. I don't like it. I told them I didn't like it because it doesn't represent who I am, what I am, and what I do. And then one day, I picked up a local paper. It was the Ashton newspaper, and a guy I know, nice solicitor, won his first trial, and he had the temerity to refer to himself as the local Mr. Loophole. And the penny dropped very quickly, and I thought, I'm not having that. I've worked hard for my Mr. Loophole. And I immediately thought about trademarking. I thought, I need to protect this. And I don't know why. I just thought, because everyone seemed to know who Mr. Loophole was, even before it was trademarked. That's how I was known, and I appreciated the value of it, not commercially, but I trademarked it. I spoke to lawyers straight away. I didn't like the idea of plagiarism being copied. I just think, well, forge your own way.
Have you ever had to invoke your trademark?
I have, yeah, you have. I mean, first of all, it took me, I think it took about 9 months to do it, and it cost a few grand to trademark it. It's not just an instant process.
Are you worldwide, Mr. Loophole? Are you global?
I believe I am, yes. I believe I am. And what's interesting is you have a legal duty to protect it. So if there was one guy who was constantly trying to breach it for commercial reasons, and I had a lot of legal correspondence. He paid damages. The damages went to charity. We're talking about a few £1,000s, not talking about fortunes. But every time there's a breach, you have to deal with it. And if you don't, you're diluting the brand. And so you've got a legal obligation to be proactive and to protect it.
Lawyers must rub their hands at the thought of this, then.
No, because...
Well, no, you're a lawyer.
Yeah, but it's not my area of law. But the point is, interesting enough, there was a friend of mine who in Scotland who wanted to set up a sort of a similar type of practice to me, and he spoke to me and said, and he explained it years ago, and I helped him, and because I can't appear in Scotland and he can't appear in England, and I helped him, and he was very grateful. And then the Mail last year referred to him as the Scottish Mr. Loophole, and I was not happy about it, and he wasn't, and he was very good, did a huge piece on radio and in the newspaper saying there is one Mr. Loophole.
Would you consider setting up a sort of franchise business? Loophole solicitors?
No. Mr. Loophole identifies me. So if you stop the man in the street, who's Nick Freeman? No idea. Who's Mr. Loophole? Oh, yeah, he's that lawyer guy who deals with celebs, which obviously is it's not completely accurate because the majority of my clients are ordinary Joe and Jane. But that's how I'm known, and it's good to have that. But the law is, without being pompous, it's a serious business, and you've got professional obligations, and it's not about it's not about making money. It's about doing what you do to the best of your ability. So to franchise it, if I franchised it, well, how are you going to ensure people do the job properly? And it's going to weaken the brand. It's going to weaken what I've done. And I'm proud of what I do. And I have a team of guys in my office, and we deal with the cases, and we do it to the best of our ability. But once you open it up to everyone, just you're basically prostituting the brand, aren't you? And commercially, that probably will be a sensible thing. But I'm not a businessman. I'm a lawyer.
From Nick Freeman, otherwise known as Mr. Loophole. Turns out Nick is from Nottingham originally, based in Manchester now with his legal practice there, and hitting the headlines every now and then in the tabloids for getting people off often driving charges because of his understanding of the law and the procedures that have to be followed, and calling out cases where procedures haven't been followed and cases get dismissed. This all came about, though, because of some mistakes he made early on in his legal career.
The end of my first week, there was a shoplifting trial in Salford, and I was sent to prosecute it. And I was always enthusiastic, and you want to do your best. You're doing it for you. That's who you are. You want to do. If you clean the dustbins or whatever, or the streets, whatever. You want to do it to the best. You want to take pride in what you do. That's what I believe in doing. And I remember prosecuting this shoplifting trial, and one of the things you couldn't do in court was lead on identification. And what I did with the store detective was point to the defendant in the dock and say, was this the lady that you saw? And of course, as soon as I did it, I read, oh my God, what have I done? Trial collapsed. They stopped the trial because I contaminated the evidence. That person was acquitted. It was very embarrassing because I just didn't know my stuff. But of course, you learn as you go along. And you learn very quickly.
But was that the beginning of you seeing that there was a way of using the literally the letter of the law to your advantage?
It was, but I think what happened was a little bit later on. I was doing a drink driving trial in the Altrincham Magistrates Court, and I remember, I looked at it carefully and thought it's straightforward, and I was trying to work out where's the defence going on it, and I remember the solicitor, he was an experienced solicitor, and I called my officer, and he gave his evidence impeccably. And I hadn't really done many drink driving trials, and I'd looked at the law superficially, but not in detail. And he gave evidence as to what the readings were. And I sat down, and he was cross-examined, and then I closed my case. And I remember hearing the solicitor stand up and say, I've got a submission of no case to make. And I remember, he then said something like, there's no admissible evidence that the machine was working. And what I'd allowed the officer to do was to give verbal evidences to the readings, but I hadn't got him to give the verbal evidences to the calibration checks on the machine. And I hadn't handed in the printout, which would have contained that evidence. And within a minute, his submission had succeeded. And I remember this sort of cold sweat breaking out my body. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I don't know my stuff. And I was just so hard on myself for it. And I remember that weekend I went into the law library and I read every single drink driving trial I could find. Wrote it out in longhand, wrote down the reason, because I needed to understand it. This was never going to happen again. And I would say, if you were going to ask me, what was the sort of the epiphany, when was the moment, I would say it was that case, because it related. Drink driving law, if you knew your stuff in those days, and I'm talking about the early 80s, you could not lose a case. And when I started defending in 1983, I was dealing basically with the very heavy criminals, the drug dealers, bank robbers, etc., etc. They were fascinating. And every so often they would have a road traffic case, often drink driving. And you get paid in those days. I think I charged £500, and it was which was a good rate because legal aid was poor. And because there were so many hoops that the police had to jump through in accordance to the law as it existed, then you couldn't lose. And I knew my stuff backwards, and I never ever lost. And I think that's what started it. And what happened was more and more people wanted to pay privately for me to defend them for road traffic stuff, whether it be drink driving, speeding, death by dangerous, or whatever, dangerous driving, reckless driving as it was in those days. And it's sort of demand, and that's how it really started.
What is the feeling you have when you've successfully defended somebody at the end of the trial? What are you feeling?
It's when you finish your case, you're obviously you're getting a feeling as you're going through it. You've prepared for it. I say it's like an exam. And waiting for the judge or magistrates to come back is a bit like waiting for those exam results. And I would say every time I win, I'm quietly euphoric, even now. I always assume I'm going to lose, and I often write out notices of appeal just in case, and that's just the way my mind works, because I just want to do everything. But you've got to revise as much as you possibly can, and it makes me feel I've given the right advice. I've spotted the point. I've given the right advice, and the court has agreed with me, because I never get people off. It's always the judge or the magistrates who say you're not guilty. Never me.
That's Mr. Loophole. Nick Freeman from